Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Green Justice, Addressing Climate Impacts and Affordable Housing. My name is Ryan Mooney Bullock. I'm the Executive Director of Green Umbrella, and we are really excited to present this session today, which is a continuation of conversations that we had at the Midwest Regional Sustainability Summit back in August. So we hope that you may have caught part of this, or I guess a teaser to this conversation during the session at the summit called Transforming a Community, Addressing Energy Affordability for Underserved Communities in Cincinnati. But you may have also heard a little bit about it through Cincinnati Edition and other media coverage that's been coming out recently, really focusing on the UC report that you're going to hear a little bit more about today, focused on energy burden and low-income communities. So there's just so many exciting pieces to this work. I'm excited to learn more about Dr. Webb's research, but also how the city of Cincinnati is really starting to mobilize some programs aimed at supporting families who are paying more than they really should be for their energy. So thank you so much for being here. I do want to just say thanks to any elected officials who have been able to join us. I know we had a few that had expressed their intent to join. If you're here, thank you so much. We may catch you a little bit later on. I also wanted to mention you're welcome to keep your video on if you'd like. If you think it's going to be distracting for any reason, feel free to turn it off. And also just stay on mute until we reach a Q&A period. That way we won't have to worry about any feedback or other background noise distracting folks. I'm going to turn it over to Savannah Sullivan.
Great, thank you, Ryan. I'm going to share my screen. All right. There we go. So thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Green Umbrella, for the opportunity to kick off your continuing education efforts with this exciting topic. My name is Savannah Sullivan, to everyone else on the phone who I haven't been able to meet yet, and I'm currently a climate and community resilience analyst with the City of Cincinnati's Office of Environment and Sustainability. And we're so happy you could join us today to explore and discuss green justice. And I just first wanted to walk through the plan for the next 90 minutes. We'll first lay out some shared language related to equity and justice. And throughout today's discussions, you'll hear us reference some equity and justice terms. So we wanted to share this framework before we dive in. Then we'll hear from Amanda Webb's research, as Ryan just mentioned, out of the University of Cincinnati, who recently worked with our office through our American Cities Climate Challenge Award to complete a report that found higher energy bills in some neighborhoods are disproportionately impacting low-income families. Next, we'll jump into some exciting updates from the city, Groundwork, Ohio River Valley, and Green Umbrella, who will each be sharing local work related to green justice and opportunities for you to get involved. We also want to hear from you today, so we'll be wrapping up with some breakout rooms where we'd love to hear your experience with these issues, what needs you see on the ground in your community or in your work, and what kind of collaborative action and further research is needed from your perspective. We will have some Q&A throughout the webinar, but feel free to drop in questions to the chat as we go, and feel free to stay on after we sort of wrap up everything. We'll have an optional extended Q&A to keep the conversation going. So first, shared language. Often you hear the terms equity and justice lumped together, and we wanted to emphasize their nuanced differences here since we're talking about justice today. Equity often refers to fair outcomes, and justice refers to the process by which those fair outcomes can be achieved. So it's a slight difference. That process of justice is often broken down into three categories. Recognition justice is the process of identifying and acknowledging injustices affecting specific populations. Amanda and David's report is a great example. Procedural justice is the process of addressing power structures and access to participation in decision-making. A key to this is ensuring equitable, inclusive, and meaningful engagement, and asking, how does our engagement shift power, build trust, and ensure accountability, both structurally in present day and intergenerationally? Distributional justice is the process of addressing the distribution of burdens as well as the benefits across different populations in a community. Using the example of energy justice, overall, equitable energy outcomes and just processes are part of a broader just transition to a low carbon economy that will remedy the injustices of the fossil fuel energy system and historical discriminatory policies, with the goal of driving towards the notion that communities should have a say and agency in shaping their energy futures. When it comes to climate and housing, an important step is recognizing which households are vulnerable to climate impacts, such as higher energy bills and extreme temperatures as the climate changes. So on that note, I would like to pass it off to Amanda and David Moore, who will be sharing findings from the recent report titled Understanding Cincinnati's Multifamily Housing Stock, an analysis to improve access to energy efficiency and for low-income households.
Okay, thanks, Savannah. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. See if we can get this to work. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep, you're good to go.
All right, thank you. I am Amanda Webb. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Architectural Engineering and Construction Management at the University of Cincinnati, and I'm here with my graduate research assistant, David Moore. And we're gonna talk to you about some of the highlights from our recent report. And I just want to say, to start off, thanks to Green Umbrella for hosting us today. We are grateful to be able to share this information with all of you and participate in this important discussion today. And I should also preface, the report is publicly available. I've got links at the bottom of each slide with a hyperlink to the report, and you can always email me if you have questions or want a PDF copy as well. So before we begin, I also just want to acknowledge some of the support that's been provided for this project. This project was definitely a project developed in conversation with many different parties. First of all, the Energy Foundation, who provided financial support for the work. And this support was provided as part of the Bloomberg Philanthropies American Cities Climate Challenge. I also want to acknowledge the support and feedback from the City of Cincinnati's Office of Environment and Sustainability, staff and partners, including Larry Falcon, Michael Forrester, Ali Kroner, Savannah Sullivan, and Carla Walker, who are on the call, many of whom are on the call today. I also want to acknowledge Rob McCracken of the Greater Cincinnati Energy Alliance, who helped provide some data to us, and then Bridget Neely of Firefly Energy Consulting. And I just want to begin by sort of stating outright, very clearly, here's what we are hoping that you get from this segment of the session today, right? I'm hoping that you're going to be able to explain some of the barriers to energy efficiency in multifamily buildings and define energy burden and identify the drivers of high energy burden, right? So really understand the context for this work. And then I want you to be able to describe some of the key energy related characteristics of Cincinnati's multifamily buildings. So effectively describe some of those key highlight results from our report. So to begin with, multifamily housing is an underserved energy efficiency market. It has been described as an untapped reservoir of energy savings, and this is really for two reasons. First of all, it is a sizable segment of the building stock. So the graph at left shows on the y-axis the number of housing units in the US, and this is in millions. And then on the x-axis, different bars represent different housing building types, right? So single family, 2 to 4 unit, 5+, and then other, which may include mobile home and other types of housing. And this data is from the American Community Survey, so that's through the Census Bureau. And what this data shows is that yes, single family housing, you know, is the majority of housing units, but that next segment, fully a quarter of our housing units in the US are in multifamily buildings. And what's particularly interesting about that big quarter segment of the building stock is that it is a very challenging segment of the building stock in which to implement energy efficiency upgrades. And this is what, you know, the underserved aspect of this is due to several barriers that are unique to multifamily buildings. And I'm going to highlight 3 today. The first is what's known as the landlord-tenant split incentive. So many residents in multifamily buildings rent. in these buildings, landlords are the ones that are going to have to pay for energy efficiency upgrades, but tenants are typically the ones who are benefiting because they're going to pay for part or sometimes all of the utility bills. So they're the ones who are going to benefit. And so it's hard to, with this split incentive, to really incentivize landlords to invest in energy efficiency upgrades. The second barrier in these types of buildings is really the wide variety of building types, right? If we consider this chunk of the stock that's single family, these buildings look relatively similar, right? They're typically envelope dominated, typically low rise. A single family building looks like a single family building most places in the country. Multifamily buildings, in contrast, have widely varied characteristics, right? And this can include, size, big high-rise buildings to sort of smaller low-rise buildings of 2 to 4 units. It can include HVAC type. So, is the building served by a central HVAC system, central heating system, or are there distributed units throughout the building? It can include ownership structure. You may have a small landlord who really just owns 1 or 2 buildings, or a large corporation. And then it can also include variation in utility bill structures. So one thing that's particularly unique to multifamily buildings is, the ways in which the different pieces and parts of the building are metered, right? So oftentimes tenants may be on individual meters for electricity, but there may be a single building meter for heating. Common areas like common area lighting and lobbies and other spaces may be billed on a totally different rate, and somebody totally different may be paying for that. So again, really hard to wrangle this segment of the building stock because it's so varied. And then the last one, the last sort of barrier I'm going to talk about is really a lack of data, right, on characteristics and performance of this segment of the stock. Ideally, policy decisions would be informed by a single unified data set on building energy performance and related characteristics. However, most cities, including Cincinnati, don't have this data. And this is really where our research came in. Let me see if I can, there we go. So energy efficiency isn't just about energy, right? It's not just about kilowatt hours. It's also about money, right? It's also about dollars spent. And so improving building energy performance isn't just about the environment. It also provides a pathway to improving equity by putting money back into people's pockets. And so one metric used to measure the equity impacts of energy efficiency or inefficiency is called energy burden, right? And this is household energy burden, as shown by this equation here, is the total annual utility spending, so electricity, natural gas, divided by the total gross household income for a particular household. So it basically measures what percentage of people's annual income are they spending on utilities. And there are many different factors that affect high or low energy burden, and I want to highlight a few of these. So if we isolate the top part of the equation, right, the things that impact total energy utility spending, we have a few things. First is the efficiency or inefficiency of the housing itself, right? And that can be sort of physical features like the fabric, the building envelope, and HVAC systems. That could also be occupant behavior, right? So the efficiency or inefficiency of the housing is also affected by how people behave in that particular housing unit. And behavior can be impacted by, lack of knowledge. It can also be affected by circumstances, right? So, older residents might be home more, retired residents, disabled residents. It can also be impacted by what's called restrictive behavior, right? So maybe because your utility bills are too expensive, you choose to keep the temperatures in your home at an unhealthily low level, right? So behavior can be a big factor as well. And then the other thing affecting how much people are paying in terms of their utility costs is fuel costs, right? How much are you paying per kilowatt hour of electricity, per therm of natural gas? Now, on the income side, right, this other part of the equation is a household's annual income. And I just want to point out that this can either be chronic low income, or it can be something, and I think this is particularly relevant for the time that we're living in now with this global pandemic, but that could be something like an acute hardship, right? A job loss, high medical bills, something else like that. And so energy burden is not necessarily a static thing, but it is dynamic based on all of these different drivers. The other thing I want to note is that energy burden is not distributed equally among demographic groups, right? And so what's shown here on this slide is results from a previous study. This was put out by the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy back in 2016. And what this shows on the x-axis is nationwide median energy burden. So this is across the whole US. And then on the y-axis, each of the bars represent a different sort of demographic group. And at the bottom, that last bar is all households, right? So for all households in the US, we've highlighted that in the red bar there, or in the red line there. It's about a 3.5% median energy burden nationwide. And a couple main points to point out here, right? Notice that all these other bars are above that all household 3.5% line, right? And that includes renters having a higher nationwide median energy burden, Latino headed or African American headed households, and then also low income households. And I also want to note in this little tag here, the study did break things down by city. Cincinnati was included, and this is a Cincinnati metropolitan statistical area. So basically sort of our tri-state area of, I think it's 7 or 8 counties here. And when the study looked at Cincinnati, it actually found higher median energy burdens for Cincinnati, right? So a 4.3% energy burden for all households in Cincinnati. And this was the 9th highest out of all the 48 MSAs that they studied. And then a 7% energy burden for African American headed households, right? And so overall, right, when we look at this distribution, this isn't fair. And energy efficiency upgrades, retrofits, they really can be used as a tool to help improve this scenario, right? So we want to recognize this scenario, and then we want to think about how can we improve this. And I want to set some context again for our work. The city actually knew about this study as it developed the 2018 Green Cincinnati Plan. And with the input of the community, goals and recommendations to improve both energy efficiency and energy burden were included in the 2018 GCP. So, you know, goal 1 in the built environment section was to decrease household energy burden by 10%. And then there are a couple of other, you know, there are recommendations in here about, you know, increasing energy efficiency in multifamily housing, and then also financing in low income households. So this is something that we as a city have decided that we want to address, right? We know that this is a problem, we want to address it here. But what we need is better data, right? So we've got this ACEEE study, and that's great. But it talks about the Cincinnati metropolitan statistical area, right? It doesn't help map things out in Cincinnati and really see how things how things vary here in Cincinnati, right? And so this is where our work comes in. And so our research goal was to develop what's called a market segmentation study, right? So we wanted to take our multifamily building stock here in Cincinnati, segment it out, look at the key characteristics, and we wanted to focus on energy burden, right? So our scope included multifamily housing with a focus on low income. And in the report, what we did is we have a section on the segmentation and energy performance results. We also have a section that we're actually not going to spend too much time on today, but really talked about, well, given these results, how might we target energy efficiency programs to specifically, you know, how might we target them around this data? How might we use this data to actually drive how we shape these programs? Savannah Sullivan and Carla Walker are going to talk about that a little bit later. How did the city actually end up using this data? And so I want to talk a little bit about how we pulled together the data here. We actually assembled a brand new data set, and we assembled it from several sources. The first is the Hamilton County Assessor. So the auditor's data was kind of the main source of information for our study, and that included information on location, square footage, how that particular parcel of land or building was being used, year of construction. And then we blended in information from Duke Energy, which included information about total electricity costs, natural gas costs, number of utility accounts. And that was at the level of the census block group, right? So our analysis really happens at the level of the census block group because that's the level at which we got energy data. And then we pulled in demographic data for each block from the US Census Bureau's American Community Survey. And just as a sort of point of reference, when I say block group, and when David's going to talk about block groups in a second, a block group is smaller than a neighborhood, but larger than a city block. And we have 282 of those census block groups here in Cincinnati. So now that I've provided some background, I'm going to turn it over to David to talk about the study results.
Thank you, Dr. Webb, and hello, everyone. So I will now be presenting some of the findings from our report, first looking at the multifamily segmentation study findings, and then also going into the energy findings, which encompass all of the residential buildings in Cincinnati, not just the multifamily. So the first finding that we see here is that multifamily residential buildings represent 31% of Cincinnati's residential square footage. And what this graph is showing, on the left y-axis, we have the number of buildings. On the right y-axis, we have square footage. And then it's broken down by residential building type: single family, two family, three family, and multifamily. And while multifamily buildings, which in this case are 4 or more units, only account for 8.5% of residential buildings, they actually account for 31% of Cincinnati's residential square footage. And if you take into account all the buildings in Cincinnati, including commercial and industrial buildings, about 25% of all the finished square footage can be attributed to these non-single family residential buildings. And that includes 2, 3 family and multifamily. And as Dr. Webb previously mentioned, this can be considered kind of an untapped reservoir of savings. 31%, this is a sizable proportion of the city's built square footage, and it offers a great opportunity for meaningful energy savings. Our next main finding is that Cincinnati's multifamily residential buildings vary greatly by type and age. So what this graph is showing, on the y-axis, we have the number of multifamily buildings, and then on the x-axis, we have the decade of construction. And this is further broken down by land use code. If you look at the legend, the colors represent different land use codes. So what you'll see is that first, Cincinnati's multifamily building stock is old. In particular, we see that the mixed use multifamily buildings, and these include office space with apartments over them and retail space with apartments over them, those blue segments on the bar graph, those are primarily constructed before 1910. On the other hand, we see that larger multifamily buildings, those 40+ unit buildings, which are represented by the light orange segments on the bar graph, those tend to be newer, mostly constructed from 1960 onwards. And you can actually see for the decade, well, 2000 and after, the majority of buildings were built, were 40+ units. And then one last thing to note here is if we look at the red segments on the bar graph, those are the 4 to 19 unit multifamily buildings. And a sizable proportion of those buildings were constructed between 1910 and 1960, and we've seen less and less of that in more recent decades. So now we'll be moving into some of the spatial data where we mapped some of our findings across Cincinnati to look at the distribution. And what this allows us to do is to see which areas of the city are most appropriate for targeted programming. And so this first map is looking at multifamily square footage, where block groups that are darker red have more multifamily square footage, and block groups that are lighter have less. And so what we see here is that multifamily square footage is concentrated in just a couple of block groups. And by looking at the map, we can see that these block groups are located downtown, as well as in pockets of Westwood, Winton Hills, Oakley, Avondale, and over the Rhine. Our next finding was that 2/3 of multifamily buildings are in very low income or extremely low income areas. And in this particular map, we are now looking at the number of buildings, not the square footage, but similar to the previous one, the darker red block groups have more multifamily buildings, and the lighter block groups have fewer multifamily buildings. And one additional piece of information that we have overlaid on this map is income. So where you see hatching on the block groups, that denotes block groups that are considered to be extremely low income. And for this report, what we've set extremely low income to be is block groups with a median household income that is less than 30% of the Hamilton County area median income. And this would be about $26,000. So extremely low income would be a median household income of less than $26,000. And then block groups that are very low income are those that have a median income that is 30 to 50% of the median income. And that would be roughly $26,000 to $40,000. And so when we break this down, what we see is that 32% of Cincinnati's multifamily buildings are located in extremely low income block groups, and another 35% are located in very low income block groups. And what's great about this map is that when we overlay this data like this, we can start to pinpoint which block groups have both a large number of multifamily buildings and are also extremely low income. So looking at this, we can see that there are about a dozen block groups or so that meet both of these criteria, that are extremely low income and have more than 40 multifamily buildings. And the location of these block groups, they're located in neighborhoods such as Mount Airy, Winton Hills, Roselawn, Avondale, West End, Westwood, and Over the Rhine. Next, we will be moving into the energy findings of our report. And just a reminder that these are for all residential buildings in Cincinnati, not just multifamily buildings. And one other thing to note is that these energy findings, for this particular one, energy cost intensity, this is not a median or an average per block group, but it's actually a gross intensity. So for this case, what we did was take the total annual cost of electricity and natural gas, the aggregate cost per block group, and divided it by the aggregate square footage of living space per block group. So what we find for energy cost intensity, or dollar per square foot, is that it is unevenly distributed across Cincinnati and is higher than benchmark values. So if you look at the map, you can see that while the majority of block groups fall within that $1 to $1.49 per square foot range, there are some higher and some lower. Particularly, we have 7 block groups with an ECI greater than $2 per square foot, which is quite high. And 207 of the 282 block groups have an ECI greater than $1.21 per square foot. And the block groups with the highest energy cost intensity, these are located in neighborhoods like Bond Hill, Roselawn, Winton Hills, and South Cumminsville. So what we can do with these ECI values is we can take what we have for Cincinnati and compare them to some benchmark values from the Residential Energy Consumption Survey, or RECS. And this is a survey conducted by the Energy Information Administration that collects energy and household data for a nationally representative sample of housing units. And so these benchmark values are listed on the slide. Since Cincinnati falls on the border of both the Midwest and the South geographic regions, we have listed both values here. So you'll see that the RECS Midwest ECI value is 77 cents per square foot, and for the South is 99 cents per square foot. And the main takeaway from here is that almost all of Cincinnati's block groups have an ECI that exceeds these RECS benchmark values. And finally, we looked at energy burden and how it's distributed across Cincinnati. We found that it is not evenly distributed across Cincinnati. Just a reminder that energy burden is the proportion of household income that is spent on utilities. And again, this energy burden, we looked at all residential buildings, not just multifamily. And also for this, again, this is gross intensity, where we took the aggregate energy expenditures for each block group and divided by the aggregate household income for each block group. And so when we look at energy burden for Cincinnati, we see a very wide range of values from 0.6% all the way up to 19.7%. And what that means is that in some areas of the city, residents could be paying almost 20% of their income just on energy, which is far too high. And just as like a baseline, a lot of the literature and research around energy burden considers anything above 6% to be high, So we can see that there are some block groups in Cincinnati that far exceed that 6% value. And when we look at the distribution, what we see is that the east side of Cincinnati has some relatively low energy burden values, while certain block groups located in neighborhoods such as Mount Airy, Winton Hills, and South Cumminsville have the highest energy burden. And energy burden is also relatively high in parts of Bond Hill, Evanston, Avondale, Walnut Hills, and the West End. So that concludes kind of the main findings of our report. You can see them in much more detail in the report itself. I'm going to turn things back over to Dr. Webb to wrap up and discuss next steps.
Thanks, David. So these results so far, as you may have noticed, are descriptive, right? We've sliced and diced this data set quite a bit, but these results are univariate, right? They focused on one variable at a time for the most part. And so what we're interested in doing now with this data is understanding how these variables relate to one another, right? And we want to identify features of the building stock or of demographics in an area that are related to high dollar per square foot or high energy burden. And what we've just done is map out some of the variables that we've been exploring here on this slide, just to be illustrative. I think we're particularly interested in looking at proportion non-white in a block group. We're also interested in looking at median year built, right? The year in which a building is built is often a proxy for features related to its construction and also proportion renters, right? As I mentioned earlier, we know that renters are in a particularly challenging position with respect to energy efficiency upgrades. And our hope really is that continuing to analyze this data will ultimately lead to better data-driven policy here in Cincinnati. That is what we have to share with you today. I think we have time for a couple questions. I don't know how to bring the chat box up. Savannah, how are we doing on time? Do we have time for a couple questions now, or should we move on?
We can take one question and then we should move to next presentation.
Sounds great. I guess there are some questions in the chat box. Yes, multifamily is 4+. If anybody wants to enter a new question into the chat box now that I can answer, I can take that now, or we'll have time at the end for Q&A.
I think one clarifying question. Oh, go for it. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Hi, thank you for presenting. I learned a lot. I was wondering if you had any variables for immigrant families, whether that's undocumented or documented, that you were studying, because I saw the median household income and the proportion non-white and poverty, but I was curious as to if you had that variable that you were trying to study as well.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thanks for making that suggestion. We have not pulled that variable yet. All of our variables, for the most part, demographics-wise, have been pulled from the ACS, but I think that's a great suggestion. This work is ongoing, and I think we can look into whether or not that exists in the ACS and the extent to which we could pull that data in. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Okay, well, with that, feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Again, we'll have time for Q&A later. And I would like to pass things off to Carla Walker and Savannah Sullivan from the Office of Environment and Sustainability. And they're going to tell you about some of the city's initiatives to improve energy efficiency and reduce energy burden here in Cincinnati. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Great, thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, David.
So, thank you, everyone. This is Savannah again, and I'll be presenting with my colleague, Carla Walker, who's the climate advisor for the city of Cincinnati. First, we wanted to dig in on some brief historical context, and this connects to some next steps that we're taking in some work with Dr. Webb and David. So we're looking forward to those next steps. So we're going to start by briefly touching upon these maps here. On the left is a draft redlining map of Cincinnati from the 1930s, which, for background, almost 100 years ago, using data and evaluations organized by local real estate professionals, a government-sponsored corporation called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, they assigned residential neighborhoods grades that reflected their quote-unquote mortgage security that would then be visualized on color-coded maps known as redlining maps. Overwhelmingly, this practice, we understand, was highly racialized. This policy ended up directing both public and private capital to native-born white families and away from Black and immigrant families. I'll add here that Cincinnati's official redlining map from the 1930s is missing, though we know where various discriminatory practices took place due to other historical documentation. And so, for example, I've used 1930 census data to identify the historically Black neighborhoods present in Cincinnati at the time of redlining policies. For example, Bond Hill, Over the Rhine, Walnut Hills, I've highlighted with the blue circles. On the right is a present day map from the Racial Dot Map project out of the University of Virginia, which reveals the racial makeup of cities across the country, visualizing trends such as segregation and density. The green dots represent Black residents, and the blue dots represent white residents. As you can see, Cincinnati is still quite segregated, with populations concentrating in similar patterns to the map on the left, and notably to patterns that we saw in some of the maps shared from Amanda and David. And these historical patterns and practices of divestment are important context for present day inequitable energy and housing related outcomes, and clearly need to inform how we move forward with creating solutions. The next level of context we wanted to add is another challenge facing our communities, which is climate change. As the climate changes, communities will become increasingly vulnerable to more frequent and extreme weather. Storms can damage infrastructure and disrupt services. The effects of increased average temperatures and higher air pollution levels associated with heat events can affect human health, and some extreme temperatures can be fatal, both hot and cold. For example, the map on the left indicates a rough understanding of which Cincinnati neighborhoods experience the highest temperatures during extreme heat events, and this can be problematic if your housing does not have appropriate cooling. At the same time, as we just learned from Amanda and David, energy costs are becoming more burdensome, and they will become more so as residents grapple with heat waves and cold snaps. Some communities have relatively high energy burdens, as you can see from the report map on the right. And I'll reference again the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy report done 4 years ago that found Cincinnati has the 8th highest energy burden for low-income families in the country, the 9th highest for Black families, and the 9th highest for renters. So clearly, we have certain populations that are more vulnerable than others. And this is largely attributed to a confluence of factors: discriminatory practices, climate change, inefficient housing, which creates a chain of injustice, leading to some housing affordability challenges for our most vulnerable Cincinnatians. In thinking about solutions to these crucial issues, we wanted to ensure that energy savings, cost savings, increased comfort, improved air quality, and greater building durability were prioritized outcomes. And in particular, we want to make sure that the solutions can be micro-targeted to the most vulnerable. For example, another great map from the report here shows the multifamily locations on the right and helps us better understand where the buildings that house renters might be, for example. That said, we also know that vulnerable residents live across all of our communities. So we've created programs that are available to vulnerable residents across the city and others that can be micro-targeted to specific buildings. Now, Carla will dive into how the city started taking steps to tackle some of the challenges I described.
Thanks, Savannah. With that framing she's provided, I just want to quickly provide a little bit of context around Cincinnati's climate goals. And Dr. Webb kind of mentioned some of this earlier in her presentation. Just so everyone is aware, Cincinnati is into its second decade of focused work on the reduction of our carbon emissions. And in 2018, the Office of Environment and Sustainability published the revised Green Cincinnati Plan. This may be old hat to some of you in the audience, and some of you actually may have participated in that broad 6-month public engagement process that created this next phase of the city's climate strategy. And the 2018 Green Cincinnati Plan focused on 3 pillars around sustainability, resilience, and equity. The plan is comprised of 8 subject matter chapters, and each chapter has a specific set of goals and recommendations. But in total, the plan represents or presents 26 goals across 80 recommendations, and that was out of about 2,000 plus recommendations that came from the community. And those 80 recommendations were selected because of their ability to have the greatest impact on moving towards that greenhouse gas reduction goals. You'll see here the goals and recommendations driving our work on energy burden, as Dr. Webb and Savannah have mentioned. We knew 2 years ago that we would need to address this particular sector of the building stock and also this particular issue of energy burden. One of the other things that happened in 2018, late in 2018, December in 2018, Cincinnati was selected to participate in the Bloomberg Philanthropies American Cities Climate Challenge. It's actually the reason why I am involved again with the Office of Environment and Sustainability with the city as their climate advisor. The challenge empowers 25 of the largest US cities to implement their near-term climate goals and ambitious plans to cut citywide emissions and become cleaner, more sustainable, and more resilient. It's a 2-year program which started in January of 2019. Once the city was selected as a climate challenge city, more specific actions were developed around how to attack that energy burden goal. And so under the challenge, the deliverable was to create energy efficiency programs for low-income families living in multifamily structures. And this is where the work of Dr. Webb and David have been very helpful. They've been involved in this project from the very beginning. Can we get the next slide, please? Great. So the low-income multifamily energy efficiency programs consist of initiatives that deliver specific services to tenants, and then a separate set of services through and to building owners. However, both of these work in concert with one another to align the interests of both parties and provide incentives to reduce energy use. And so this is where actually I think it's Richard Drake who has the question in the chat box. We'll get into this, right? This programming is actually funded by Duke Energy Ohio as a result of a rate case settlement with the city of Cincinnati. This provides the city of Cincinnati with about $250,000 a year for about 6 years. And we're into the second installation of those funds. It sounds like a lot of money, but with respect to kind of doing the upgrades, not just the in-unit upgrades that I'm going to share with you, but also some of the capital work that needs to be done, that money does not go as far as we would like for it to go. Definitely not as much as is needed. We don't have as much as needed as the need would indicate. So I'm going to walk you through the elements of the tenant side of the program that we have created here in Cincinnati, and then I'll turn it over to Savannah to talk about the programs that we are working on for building owners to address some of the capital issues. The Warm Up Cincy program, which we launched in February of this year, is designed specifically to connect with families at or below 200% of the federal poverty limit, renting in a multifamily building in the city of Cincinnati. Now, for the purposes of this particular program, when we talk about multifamily units, we're talking about 2 units or more. We've partnered with Community Action Agency as well as people working cooperatively to help implement this program. And I want to give a mention to Rob McCracken and his work at the Greater Cincinnati Energy Alliance, which sadly is no longer in operation, but they were also very involved in the development of this program. Families that are eligible and become participants in Warm Up Cincy, they receive free energy upgrades in their unit, in their apartment. They receive an energy strategy for their family. They get additional energy education and up to $500 on their Duke Energy bill. And that is at no cost to them. Like I said, we launched this program in February, but we have been operating it through the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. And I'm happy to share that we've been able to provide energy efficiency services and upgrades and financial assistance to 31 families to date. Can I have the next slide, please? And we know that this is actually working, right? The in-unit upgrades being made by our partner, people working cooperatively, are things like weather stripping, pipe wrapping, faucet aerators, light bulbs as well, right? And in some cases, you'll see here by this particular testimony, we are replacing refrigerators. And just a note, we're working with PwC, and they actually have a history of doing these kind of upgrades. They do work with landlords to upgrade appliances such as refrigerators and freezers. We estimate that these upgrades, along with the more efficient, energy efficient tenant, will save families on average up to $118 a year. So we're putting that money back into their pockets. But as I mentioned before, those families that are participating in the program also receive that up to $500 directly on their Duke Energy bill. As well, the education element of the program is designed to stay with the tenant. So if that family moves, and this happens quite frequently with the residents we are targeting, if that family moves, they can go into their next or new apartment knowing what needs to be upgraded and how to reduce their energy costs. So as I mentioned earlier, this tenant program is paired with a program that focuses on building owners. So I'll hand this back over to Savannah to talk a little bit more about that.
Great. Thank you, Carla. So yeah, for next steps for the city, we'll be continuing to offer Warm Up Cincy. We sometimes call it Cool Down Cincy in the summer. That's probably what we'll do moving forward. But we'll also be launching 2 new programs for multifamily buildings. One will be a small matching grant program up to $5,000 per building. So this would be applied for by the building owner, kind of getting at that split incentive issue Dr. Webb and David described earlier. We'll also be launching a larger comprehensive pilot program, granting significantly more funding to individual buildings, where through both of these programs, we're targeting beyond just the individual unit to the equipment and systems that touch upon the whole building itself. So the HVAC, insulation, et cetera. And so both programs are dedicated to achieving deep energy savings for low-income residents and protecting affordability in Cincinnati. The report Amanda and David presented on is key for us to be able to micro-target and prioritize these services to the buildings and residents who need them most. So be sure to check this website. It's our energy equity website later this year, and sign up for our newsletter to receive the announcements when these programs launch. I also wanted to touch upon 2 additional related efforts that elevate the procedural equity and justice components I described earlier. So first is a community science campaign we recently completed with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where we engaged dozens of Cincinnati residents to create a more detailed heat map than what I showed earlier to help us understand which neighborhood blocks have the greatest risk of extreme heat effects. And we can use this information to make sure those residents have access to heat reducing services such as cooling centers, street trees, energy efficient air conditioners. The last effort we want to highlight is a partnership for systemic change, where nonprofit and local government work together to ensure equity in climate change planning. Our office and Groundwork Ohio River Valley are teaming up on a local pilot project with national reach. Climate Safe Neighborhoods is a Groundwork program, and the National League of Cities Resilience cohort is something the city is participating in. And they are initiatives that develop the ability of underserved communities to self-advocate, ensure the inclusive engagement of residents in climate planning, and improve the city's capacity to equitably serve those most affected by climate change. And with that, I'll pass it off to Tanner Yes, the co-executive director at Groundwork Ohio River Valley, who will describe that effort in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Savannah. Hi, everyone. Please shake it out if you need to. I know I'm at that phase of the Zoom experience, so get up. We can't see your face, yeah, you can do some jumping jacks, whatever you need. Let me share my screen here, and we will get right into it. So again, my name is Tanner Yes with Groundwork Ohio River Valley. I'm incredibly grateful to be here as part of this panel with amazing partners and showcasing this work. Groundwork is where justice and the environment meet. We're the region's only environmental nonprofit with leaders of color at all levels of staff and board. We're the city's largest youth employer for green jobs, working with CRC, connecting income and sustainability. We're the operating partner for the Light Up Avondale Energy Efficiency Program, giving residents free energy upgrades, and managers of the Climate Safe Neighborhoods project that we'll be talking about today. Climate Safe Neighborhoods is a collaboration with the Office of Environmental Sustainability, supported by the Kresge Foundation and the JPB Foundation. So I hope you're not bored of maps already, because we have a few more to go, but I want to give you a little bit of background, and I'll get through this pretty quickly so we can move on to the next presenter and then breakout groups. Injustice is an old story, right? A lot of this that we're talking about today is not known. It may be the lens that you're viewing this through or the way that we're going about it. In Cincinnati, it's getting hotter and wetter. These impacts are not being felt equally among neighborhoods, among residents. We all went through with Amanda and David. And there are consequences like extreme heat, mold through rain, all sorts of other things. And in fact, many deaths due to heat is one of the largest environmental consequences in the nation. So it's no accident that some people feel climate change impacts more than others. Our approach, however, is different. This is what Groundwork's all about. Instead of being told what to do or being studied for yet another time, we are working with neighborhoods and flipping the paradigm towards youth empowerment, resident-led science, and advocacy. And we're planning for action. We're also looking for help from all of you. Your work does connect to this stuff in one way or another, something we hope to explore more in the breakout sessions. Today, we're showcasing a really awesome connection between academia, government, and practitioners, and we're hoping you can plug in. So for Climate Safe Neighborhoods, these are basically the goals, and I'm gonna skip ahead to long term. We want action on the ground. We're out in the streets every day here. We're piloting this program in Lower Price Hill, where I am right now. And as an example of a community that's been studied to death, we're not interested in doing that again. We're interested in recognizing, listening, and getting stuff done. So that's going to take the form of short-term and long-term policy impacts. So what happens when we have the history, we have the redlining, and not just redlining, there's zoning, there's mobility policy, there's all sorts of other things. And we layer that with what we now know about climate change impacts. And here we go on a few maps for you. This is probably pretty obvious. We have two shape files here. One is tree canopy. You can see that in green, and the other is impervious surfaces, being concrete or whatever, wherein rain cannot penetrate. So as you can imagine, through our Mill Creek corridor, through the highly industrialized zones, we have more impervious surfaces, fewer trees, which means hotter temperatures and no place for rain to go, except for the combined sewers potentially. Here we have our Landsat 8 satellite, which I always chuckle when I say that the good people at NASA are working with a bunch of misfits here at Groundwork, but we got this data from them, and Savannah's team has gone even further to get on the ground data with volunteers that we will be incorporating into the Climate Safe Neighborhoods project. This is surface temperature. And you can see that it pretty much correlates to where the impervious surfaces are. There are no trees. Again, no surprises. A lot of what we do at Groundwork is combining the social, racial, justice or injustices into environmental and sustainability work. So here we have a heat vulnerability index. Heat vulnerability index is made up of 4 factors: percent households in poverty, mean surface temperature, mean impervious surface summarized, and mean tree canopy cover summarized from NLDC. So we have that with census block group income, and we'll use Lower Priscilla as the example again, where we're working for the pilot of climate safe neighborhoods. It has a high heat vulnerability index and, you know, not a huge amount of income for that block group. And a lot of this lines up with what Amanda and David were talking about as well. So we're just looking at it from potentially a different angle here. This is just the start of the Climate Safe Neighborhoods project. We're going to be releasing dashboards and maps and data that are community generated. Again, the difference here is a citizen and youth-led effort. Please keep in touch so you can volunteer, support, or participate. And another great way and segue to our next presenter for participation is I'm going to hand this off to Rashida, who can talk about getting involved right now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rashida Manuel, Director of Public Engagement with Green Umbrella. Before I get started, I want to ask you all to bear with me. I'm having internet connection issues today, so I will do my best to make sure that you all can hear what I'm saying and see my screen. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen today. But what I'd like to talk to you about is about a new initiative that we are launching at Green Umbrella called Environmental Health and Housing. So at Green Umbrella, we really focus on collaboration, and we're excited to launch this new impact team with the goal of building cross-sector collaboration around affordable housing. So around affordable housing, health disparities, and environment. This team is Green Umbrella's first explicitly environmental justice focused impact team, and I'm so excited for many of you to be a part of it. So we often hear that marginalized communities, especially communities of color, are most impacted by climate change and environmental hazards. But what does this really look like? So we've talked about that throughout this webinar today. It looks like higher rates of asthma and other respiratory illnesses in communities with lower incomes. It looks like communities being more susceptible to the increase of illness that we are seeing as a result of our shifting climate. And we're seeing that right now with COVID and the higher rates in Black and Brown communities. It looks like high rates of even issues like infant mortality and maternal mortality, which we're seeing in the same communities that are being impacted by the issues that we're discussing today. A few years ago, the Urban League released a report called The Tale of Two Cities. And what it really chronicled is the disparities that we are seeing in our Black communities as compared to our white communities. And one of the things that they detailed was that there are shorter life expectancies in communities of color right here in Cincinnati. And so at Green Umbrella, our mission is to lead collaboration and incubate ideas and catalyze solutions that create a resilient, sustainable region for all. And the goal of this team, the Environmental Health and Housing team, is really to look at who is included in that all that we're talking about when we say that we want a sustainable region for all. And what strategies can we develop collectively to make this mission a reality? So we'll do this by pulling together a cross-sector team and leveraging the knowledge, experience, resources, and wisdom of our partners. Affordable housing is a hot topic right now, and that's a great thing. And so we really want to, we know that there are so many entities that are doing this work right now, and they're doing it in various capacities. But what happens if we bring them into conversation with each other? What can we achieve if we coordinate our efforts? How can we build partnerships with institutions that can conduct the research we need and provide the data that we need to really guide our efforts? Just like Dr. Webb, David, Savannah, and Carla detailed today. How can we ensure that the conversation around providing more affordable housing also includes making sure that that housing is green housing? If this sounds like something that you're interested in, and if it aligns with the work that you're doing currently, please get in contact with me. we'll start by pulling together a steering committee who will lead the effort once it's launched. So the way that we do this with our impact teams is that we'll pull together the small steering committee of local leaders who will lay the foundation for the effort and really start working together to figure out what it looks like, what goals we'd like to achieve, who we'd like to be in the room. And then we'll, once we get all of that figured out, we'll launch it publicly and get folks to get involved in that way. So I want to be clear that while we are convening and supporting this effort, we being Green Umbrella, we recognize that these issues can only be solved collectively. And so in the spirit of collective work and collaboration, I want to invite you all to get involved or to share your work and have a conversation with us right now. We're going to break into small groups. So Jesse, if you want to go ahead and start that process, and we'll start in those small groups. We'll go ahead and talk a little bit more about what we've discussed today in more detail. So thank you all. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you all had a good discussion in your small groups. I know for some of us, there was a little confusion maybe in the beginning with some reshuffling of the groups, but hopefully that didn't detract from the conversation and you all got to dive a little bit deeper into this work and share out what you all have been working on yourselves. So as we are working on as we pull back together, I'd love to hear from each of you, each of the groups, what you all talked about. So if you have a representative who'd like to share what your discussion was during our breakouts. And I will start with Carla's group, because you're right next to me on this little screen.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Rashida. There were 4 of us in the group. Myself, Jennifer Zavon, who is working out of OES, the Office of Environment and Sustainability. She is a resident of North Avondale. Kelsey Hawkins Johnson, who is also an OES, a resident of Hartwell, and then Emily Imhoff, who is a resident of Westwood, and she is working at the Cincinnati Museum Center. So quickly, what we talked about in terms of like how these issues intersect with our lives, there were 2 interesting comments. One of the folks just learned that they are living in one of the very low income neighborhoods, and they also recognize that their neighborhood is one of the neighborhoods kind of in the midst of the energy burden map. So that was kind of interesting to see that that was something that they were not aware of. Then the other kind of interesting comment from the group was that those of us who are renters are actually living if we're renters and we're very interested in kind of reducing energy, our energy footprint, we're living the split incentive dilemma, right? It's just nice to have like a name for what it is that we're experiencing. In terms of how what issues and needs are happening at our organizations, Emily over at the Museum Center was expressing that she did early on try to organize a group of workers on sustainability at the museum, but with the COVID and some of the shutdowns, there wasn't really, there was some difficulty in kind of getting folks together. She also is managing some of the recycling work over at the museum, which is kind of cool. We talked a little bit about like what are possible collaborations, and one of the things we talked about was having some further conversations about whether or not there's an opportunity for us, meaning the city, to work with the Museum Center on some of their temporary exhibit space and create something that would highlight some of this, the work that we are doing, or even the issue around sustainability and equity and energy burden and affordable housing, and put something together for a temporary exhibit. And then finally, in terms of like what data we would like to see, some additional tree canopy data, potentially like satellite imaging to help identify some of the other vines and that might be potentially suffocating trees in our neighborhoods. That's something that would be interesting to explore, as well as ethnographic data to learn more about occupant behavior for some of the warm-up Cincy work that we're doing. But then further evaluation of that program just to see what the participant experience might be.
Great, thank you for sharing out, Carla. That's great. I will move on in the, we have about 3 minutes left and then we're gonna try to do some Q&A. So please stay with us if you can. I'm gonna move on to Tanner's group. Tanner, I don't know if you or one of your group members wants to share out.
I got volunteered, so I'll jump in. And for those who don't know me, I'm new to town. I just moved here earlier in May, but I'm working with the National League of Cities and helping Savannah with some of the work there. Our group had a variety of different conversations, shared lovers of maps and data, so we're really appreciating all the presentations that everyone had to share. I think a lot of our conversations revolved around the intersectionality between a lot of the map topics, and a lot of the work that I'm engaged in is around kind of active transportation and mobility and thinking around housing vulnerability, access to public spaces, other types of mobility constraints, and especially in a COVID era. And then an additional layer, also kind of racial equity issues as well. And as someone who just graduated from graduate school, and Julia in our group currently at UC, kind of thinking from an academia perspective, how can we ensure that these issues are brought up, especially the intersectionality aspects and kind of how all these issues relate to each other.
Thank you, Joshua. I think we've met before, so I'm good to see you. I'm glad you're on this call. All right, Amanda, I'll move to your group.
Sure, and I'll share my screen. Andrew is going to, we have some messy notes, and Andrew's going to talk you through them.
Right, let's see if we can navigate this well. Can we scroll down just a little bit?
Sure.
All right, eating precious time, understand that. But I think that one of the biggest parts of the conversation that we had was that there just still is a lack of awareness essentially between two major components of the city. You have this idea of some of the haves, if you will, individual homeowners and people who live in their homes versus that of, say, tenants and landlords. And so how a lot of times, say, communication or at least directions of some of these efforts can go above the heads of those who happen to be living in some of these places that, you know, occupy a large amount of the square footage and not just a number of buildings. And I was actually got to one point that Sue had pointed out, is that when city personnel try to reach out to some of these tenants and residents, a lot of times they aren't actually able to see any of the individual residents or families within a specific unit. And so one of the quotes that I wrote down from C is that each unit is respected. What they see currently is essentially maybe just one unit or even just like the building as a whole. So if they wanted to engage with residents and perhaps some more proactive energy behavior, it's incredibly difficult, just the means in which some of the ways that the residents are structured that the city has access to. And so, yeah, this essentially this divide in which we live in, those who own property and own houses versus that who actually lives there. So I know we're short on time, I'll stop there, but it's an interesting divide in which the city exists in.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yep.
Thank you. All right, I will move on to Savannah, my and Savannah's group, and we have Dana Bull, who will share out for us. And Dana, if you could unmute yourself, please.
All right. Hey, this is such a great presentation. Okay, I'm having trouble getting my, let me just minimize this. Okay, so we have a lot of challenges in Norwood. Now, am I sharing about Mary as well, Savannah?
Yeah, you'll share for both Mary and you.
Okay, so Mary's issues, given their location, the Beekman corridor, is they have a lot of sewer issues, and so they are trying to work with the network, which includes College Hill and working with runoff and rain barrels and so on to decrease what's actually the volume of water that's actually going into the sewers. So in getting people, they're finding that they have more engagement than maybe would be expected. So good for them. Let's see. As far as, okay, now I'm so their interest is in sewer justice, and actually we have a lot of those issues in Norwood too. It's just not something that I'm taking on right now. That's more of the city's project. So in Norwood, some of the things that we're looking at are we're really trying to offer alternatives to asphalt, especially in our city-owned properties where we, you would think that it would be easier to address some of those issues, because with using pervious pavement or new technologies like TrueGrid is actually cheaper than installing asphalt, and then creates a space that can have more uses than, say, parking only. So we're trying to find things that will do double duty and also create locations that are more friendly to trees, because obviously from Tanner's maps, you can see we have a huge problem with heat island effect in Norwood. And to that point, Mary's group is interested in coming up with comprehensive programs, because everything's tied together. Collaborative action. So she's looking to the state to help her group, and we're kind of realizing that we need the county's help, and Green Umbrella has been enormously helpful as far as picking up the phone and calling people and getting Norwood connected outside of Norwood, which is really what needs to happen. So we're looking at continuing our community readiness model in Norwood, and just engaging the residents that are wanting trees, pavers, bricks, bike lanes, and all those other things. So, and try to keep our conversation as we move through change. We're trying to really work on keeping the conversation really neutral and empathic. And that's like a big job for me. So that's it.
Thanks, Dana.
Great job. Thank you, Dana.
I felt like I took too long there. I apologize.
No, you're fine. We had a really good conversation, so you had a lot to capture. Thank you. All right, so we have 3 more groups, and I will say that we will, in the spirit of time, we'll keep the comments down to about a minute each. So David, I will pass it over to you for your team and what you all discussed.
Yeah, thank you. So we had some great discussions. I'll keep it pretty brief, but some of the issues identified were kind of water quality issues and combined sanitary sewer overflow, and especially in older parts of the city and the lowest lying areas of the city being most at risk. Some other things that were brought up were kind of like a lack of affordable housing and ensuring that housing that's being built is resilient and being built so that it can kind of withstand the effects of climate change or these more extreme weather events. And then just some talking about data and analysis that's needed. We talked about tree planting programs and kind of researching the effects that maybe other cities have had that have undergone kind of tree planting programs and incorporating that into Cincinnati. And also we touched on the importance of recognition justice and making sure that whenever we are implementing any programs into specific communities, that we're bringing in community members from the very beginning, ensuring that they're part of the discussion. And yeah, I'll wrap it up there, but thank you.
Thank you. All right, Larry, I believe you had a group if you'd like to share.
Yeah, so we had a small group. It was only one person besides myself. And so our discussion went down a little bit of a side channel. The person that I was with works for a bank in community lending in support of the Community Reinvestment Act. And they're mostly involved in construction and rehab of housing in low-income census tracts. And so our discussion explored the possible role of CRA capital in helping to get some of the energy retrofits done in some of these buildings. We talked about the role of CDF, the Cincinnati Development Fund, in the city's energy efficiency landlord programs. And, you know, he's involved from the banker's side with CDF on some of their programs. And so it's kind of a niche discussion about banking role in the process.
Thanks, Larry. Charlie, you are next.
All right, so I'll try to be quick here. We had a really great discussion, a diverse group of people from different organizations. And some of the things that came out of it, we talked about we'd like to see more integrated efforts and better, both geographically among different municipalities, the city, the county, et cetera, as well as from different programmatic work. So like, you know, if there's waste and recycling efforts, integrating that with the energy efficiency efforts, and you know, efforts to clean up blight and illegal dumping, and so all these different green efforts that we're doing in communities to try to create a more integrated approach. And then we also talked about that one of the major issues is getting access to whether to owners, as well as building trust and relationships with tenants and being able to get them to welcome you into their home. And that you know, so maybe building relationships with community leaders, working with organizations that are on the ground that deliver direct services that already have these kinds of relationships. We talked about benchmarking the success of other programs like Light Up Avondale. And we also talked about how community organizations are often asked to do too much and they're strapped for funding and staff capacity, and that if we can increase those things, that would increase the bandwidth for them to do more. And then lastly, we mentioned as far as data and analysis, one idea was to actually do more surveying of residents to try to get their feedback and ideas for solutions, and to balance the qualitative and quantitative.
Thanks so much, Charlie. And I think the point that you made about how organizations are strapped is you know, for resources is key. And I think that's also part of why a collaborative effort is necessary, so that we can support each other, other organizations, and make sure that the work continues to move forward in those instances. All right, well, I would just want to thank you all for being here today. I'm going to turn it over to Savannah, but before I do that, I just want to say that this is part of our Midwest Regional Sustainability Summit continuous learning efforts, and there will be other opportunities for you to learn about the work that's happening in our community and how you can get involved and help to push that work further. So thank you again for being here, and I'll turn it over to Savannah.
Great, thank you, Rashida, and thank you to everyone again for joining us today. I am going to share my screen just briefly again so that you can see all of our contact information. We want to leave you with that so you can reach out to us if you have any questions. But really, we just want to emphasize thank you for taking the time today to hear our presentations, but also to engage with us. I can speak for our group, and I can tell from all the other groups that it was a super fruitful continuing education effort in these breakout rooms. We're looking forward to more. Thank you to Green Umbrella for this opportunity and for hosting this webinar. Shout out to Jesse Velasquez for all of his behind the scenes support to make this webinar happen. And yeah, we hope that you all will continue to engage on green justice efforts. And please reach out to any of the names listed here to learn more and get involved with everything we talked about today. We look forward to hearing from you.